Hi, welcome back. So this is a pretty important video because we're talking about a concept that is going to be used constantly in the next few sections, and it's a very, very important part of CSS and kind of defines the way that you look at documents. So the two properties that we're going to be looking at are float, which is the less important one, and display, which is the very important property that we need to learn. So let's cover float first because it's an easier thing to approach. But before we start, for both of these elements, you need to understand the concept of inline and block level elements. So first of all, elements have a certain display type, which we're going to be manipulating in the next property. This display type pretty much defines the behavior of the element. So there are two main display types, block and inline. So pretty much if we look at our HTML document here, we go through and you can see all of these tags. Creating these tags create a sort of display behavior for the content inside them. So the block level element, what it basically does is moves everything onto its own section, its own, block. So an example of one of these elements would be a p tag. You can see that if this was an inline element, it would be flowing with the rest of the things. But you can see here, despite the margin, this is moved onto its own section. It's not playing or moving after the image. It's moved onto its own section, and everything after it comes after, the block. On the other hand, an inline element is something that won't really move anything onto its own section. It's going to keep it intact. It's not going to move it or change it in any way. It's just going to leave it how it naturally occurs on the page. So a very good example of one of these would be a span tag, because what a span tag pretty much does is it's used to contain some piece of content in an inline style. So for example, this italics class would be a perfect representation of an inline tag. What we're trying to do is italicize some text. And if the span was a block level element, this text here, this italicized text, would be moved onto its own section. So everything preceding it would come before it, and then there would be a new line with the text, and then after it would come the rest of the text. So you can see there that the inline and block level tags really make a difference depending on what you want to use it for. So what we're going to be doing in this video is going through and learning how to change the display type of these different elements. But first, let's talk about float. So again, these tags come with a natural display type, and how they are placed on the page is how they naturally occur. But there's actually a way to change the way that they look, and this is done using float. So if you just listen to the name there, what the element pretty much does is change how the element, floats on the page. So I'll go ahead and do some examples here. For example, let's just take this gradient here, this div. So I'm going to go and look for it, the service image. I'm going to say set the float, and I'm going to say it floats to the right, and watch what happens. You can see that now what happens is pretty much this just flows over to the right side of the page, and it also changes all the content after it. So you can see that this content here has now been pushed up. So this kind of shows a little bit of how float works. And this doesn't just have to be with images. We can do it with text as well. So if I go through and choose something like this element over here, this link here. So I'm going to go ahead on this link, and I'm going to say it floats to the right. Now let's go ahead and refresh the page. And you can see that that kind of flows over to the right, and everything before it is now kind of pushed up where it was. So you can think of this as kind of a Tetris puzzle block. When you're moving something over, everything is going to be pushed up or moved around as well, so to fit the page. So you can kind of think of it in that way. Now obviously, once you start getting a lot of experience with float, you can kind of predict where everything is going to move on the page. But floats are really useful for laying out documents, especially if you want to kind of position images next to text or move things around in a way that looks more like a proper document. So I'm going to remove that float, and I'm just going to do it with our image over here, with our image, our About Us image. So I'm going to go ahead and say it floats over to the right. See that? So now you can see that it floats over to the right, and now everything before it has kind of been pushed up onto this section here. So there we go. Now it's working and everything is looking great. Now let's look at the next property, which is display. So display is pretty much a way of, well, changing the display property of an element that it naturally comes with. So of course we know things like a div or a paragraph tag come as a block level element, whereas something like a span or a bolding tag would come as an inline element. So what we're going to be doing is going through and changing these properties. Now I didn't actually cover the properties of float, which I'm going to go over in just a second, but what I'm going to talk about is the different properties of display. So of course you have the standard inline and block, which is pretty obvious, but then you have a few others. So the one that I'm going to be covering here is none now. So what the display none property does is pretty much just completely almost remove the element from the page. Now it doesn't actually remove it, but what happens is that invisible box that contains everything just suddenly disappears. You can't see it anymore. It doesn't take up any space. It's just completely gone from the page. So I'm going to show you what that looks like right now. Let's go ahead and, for example, let's just say that this table is kind of annoying. We don't really want it here. So what I'm going to do over here in my table is give it a class of site table. Now I'm going to go ahead and select it here, .site-table. And I'm going to say display is none. Now watch what happens. You can see that that table completely disappears. And it doesn't even take up the space anymore. It's not like the table is just invisible or not visible, but it's completely gone now. This is very, very commonly used once you start using JavaScript and once you start making your sites interactive to maybe create web games or hide something, maybe create some sort of hidden token. It can be used for all sorts of things. So this is a very useful display property. So I'm going to go ahead and remove that. Now the next one I want to talk about, and I'll just keep it there if we decide to use it later. The next one I'm going to talk about is inline block. So we know that we have two different display types, inline and block, but there's actually a combination of the two, which is a little bit hard to understand, but once we start using it, you can see how useful it is. So inline block is a little bit, well, like I said, it's a little bit hard to understand, but pretty much what it does is take features from both inline and block level elements and combines them together. So we know that inline elements do not move anything onto their own line. We know that they stay in their place, they don't touch anything or move anything around. Whereas block level elements move them onto the new line. Now what happens is that this inline block element takes that sort of new line feature and removes it completely. It does not move anything onto its own new line. But what the block level elements do is they actually create some spacing around the element once it's moved onto its new block. So the inline block element then takes this and puts it into itself. So the inline block element pretty much keeps everything in the same line, but creates that block level spacing that it can be found in other block level elements. So let's go through and actually demonstrate how this works. I'm going to go back to my table and add our inline block display property here. Inline block. Now I'm going to go ahead and refresh the page and see what happens. So you can see that it's kind of kept on the same line, but it's given that sort of spacing or, well, block level spacing that you can't really find with a normal inline element. If I actually go ahead and change this to inline here, you'll see this very apparent. You can see that click here to Google text has now moved around. There's a little bit of a weird box here. So you can see the difference between an inline element and an inline block element. So there you go. Inline block is a very useful display property. You can use it a lot in your website to maybe lay out grids and all sorts of things like that. And we're actually going to be using some very special display properties later in this course called Flex and Grid, which are really going to help us create these beautiful grids and layouts that can transform our website in every way. So that's pretty much it for display. Now let's go on to talk about some of the other float properties because I kind of wanted to save it for last. So we already know that there are two main float properties, which are left and right. But there's actually a few more that we can use that are sort of different and they're not very conventional, but they're still apparent and they can, change the way that, an element floats on the page. So the first one is the most interesting one. It's the one that is, well, the only real floating element, which is called inherit. So you can see here that we have child elements and parent elements. Now, what's really interesting is what can happen is if we have, let's say, a div with an h2 and an image in it. What we can do is pretty much set the div's float as right, and we can set one of the child elements, such as the h2, we can set its float as inherit. What's going to happen is it's going to take the float property of the parent element. Now, you're probably asking why this would be useful at all. Well, pretty much what you can do is you can actually lay out multiple elements without having to specify their float as long as they're children and parents. So for example, if you have an element that's maybe 4 or 5 levels deep and you don't want to specify the float every time, you can just use an inherit element to move everything to the right side with only specifying the float once. So the last value I want to talk about is the none value. So this is kind of the default value that you're going to see if you don't specify anything, and it's pretty much just going to keep the item in its place. It's not going to change its float or its display, and it's pretty much not going to move it around at all. It's not the same as display none though. It doesn't really remove anything. What float none pretty much does is just leaves it where it naturally occurs in the text. So for example, if you have a block level div tag and you set its float to none, then it's just going to appear as a block level element. It's not going to move around or do anything similar. So there you go. That's pretty much it for floats and displays. We're going to be working with these a lot throughout the rest of this course, and they're very important properties. So I recommend you get some practice with them and start using them so you can see all of the different ways that you can use the display and float properties in your website. Now, apart from the box model and a few other ways, displays and floats are a very common way, or at least they were, of manipulating your website and making it look really good. So without it, the website is just kind of everywhere. All the elements are scattered around. But if you want to really make the website look how you want it to look, you need to use this in combination with a few other features that we are going to learn in the future in order to make your website look great. All right, let's move on.